Yo, what's going on, guys? My name is Ethan Shaw and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I want to talk about camera basics and understanding shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So when you pick up your camera for the first time, you're going to notice that all cameras, all manual cameras, have these three settings. And if you want to be proficient and learn your camera inside and out, you will have these three things dialed by the time you're adventuring on into your photography journey. So again, that's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So let's start with shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long your shutter is really open and letting light into the sensor or film. If you have a really fast shutter speed, everything is going to freeze in motion and you won't have a lot of light into your photo, but it'll be nice and sharp. If you let the shutter speed open a little longer, you'll have a lot more light to play with, but things might be blurry and it's not as sharp. So if I just grab my camera here, that's a really fast shutter speed. Not a lot of light is getting let into the sensor, but everything is freezed and in motion. Now if I slow it down a lot, so say maybe, even a quarter second, which is way too slow for anything we normally shoot, the shutter is opening much slower. Your camera is definitely letting in a lot more light, but it's also capturing a quarter of a second of motion and light into the photo. So you really have a blurry image unless you really want something like that or you stabilize it with a tripod. Now that you have a rough idea of what shutter speed actually does to your photos, I'm going to show a couple examples here of me throwing my camera and catching it. And show you guys the difference. So this first photo here is taken at 1/640th of a second, and this is a really quick shutter speed and stops most of the motion. There's very little motion blur in this photo, but there was a little bit of motion blur because the camera was moving really quickly. If you drop it and it takes, a quarter of a second, that's still a lot of motion for the camera to be doing in a quarter of a second. So basically, I upped the shutter speed a little more. So now we have 1/1250th of a second. And this has completely froze the camera in place, although it's a lot darker because we had to increase the shutter speed that much more and really made it snap. Alright, so for this last photo here, this was taken at 1/80th of a second, which is not that fast. And you can see the camera is almost completely blurred out because it's traveling so fast. You can also see the directional motion blur because it's going from up to down. You kind of get that sort of pan. 1/80th of a second for moving objects is definitely pretty slow. And then also, if this photo wasn't taken on a tripod, you'd also get a little bit of motion blur if you're not holding the camera steady. So some other ways to actually make this blur look good is by panning. So let's say a car or motorcycle or even biker is driving by you or riding by you, you can pan with them. So if you're matching the same speed as them, the background is now going to be blurred and your subject will now be still. You can see in these photos that the background is completely blurred out, but my friend is still pretty still because I was tracking him and moving at a really fast clip. And this makes it so you can get away with shooting at a low shutter speed, but still having your photos sharp. So now let's talk about aperture. Aperture is basically the amount of light your lens is letting into the camera sensor. So you have how fast the exposure is going to happen, but then you have how much light is going to hit the sensor. So all lenses have an aperture control. This lens is a really wide aperture. You can see right through it. And basically, when you close your aperture, it'll close the amount of light trying to hit the image, which is totally fine, especially when it's a nice bright day out. You don't want too much light hitting your sensor. So when you change your aperture, it's also going to change how much is in focus when you're taking your photo. This is also called the depth of field. So this photo right here was taken with this 50mm lens. Shot at f2.8. F is just what it's called. It's just kind of the way it is. Not a lot of stuff is going to be in focus when you have a nice wide aperture. This is also called like fast lenses, or something with a really, big or wide aperture, and that would be the f number. All right, so this next photo is taken at f11. So not a lot of light is entering the sensor because the lens is just closed down. And basically I had to open my shutter speed a lot more so I get, roughly the same amount of light. And now the background is nice and sharp and pretty in focus. Even though there's distance between my hand and the background, a lot more is in focus because there's a deeper depth of field, and more is in focus when you have a, lower or slower aperture. So this would be really good for landscapes, stuff like that, where you want everything in focus and you want a nice big landscape and the mountains are in focus and your foreground is in focus and everything is all good. The f2.8 would be good for lots of artsy shots and portraits where you want that subject to be separated from the background, and you get that nice blurry background and the depth of field and everything is all good. So this is why it's super nice to have a nice big wide open fast lens, so you can either choose to have everything in focus or have nothing in focus and really separate your subject from the background. Alright, so lastly we have ISO. And ISO is how sensitive your sensor is to light. How will it react to light? You can basically make fake light with your photos. So let's say you really wanted everything in focus and you don't want to have a shaky or blurry photo. You can just bump up the ISO so you have more light in your photos. So when you bump up your ISO too high, you can have a very pixelated or noisy looking image, and you really don't want that. So it's best to shoot at a low ISO, and when you need to, say when you're shooting at night or when you really need to catch something in motion, then you can bump up your ISO and kind of play that sort of game. So now that you know all three, you can totally shoot in manual and determine how much light your photo has based off of trial and error, and using your camera's light meter to determine how much light is actually shown in your images. You can obviously overexpose your images or underexpose your images, and you'll go from there. And you'll get to a point with these three things and you'll know exactly what to do, what aperture you need, what shutter speed you need, and what you kind of crafted in your mind, and then how to put that out in a photo and what settings to use when you're shooting. So this is just all part of the fun, and it really takes a bit of time to learn, and then you just dial it in and it's second nature to you. And yeah, that's about it. Alright guys, so hopefully you enjoyed my YouTube video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video if you want to see more like this. So with that being said, have a great rest of your day and keep shooting.